Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Paul, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. Would you mind reintroducing yourself? Because it's been like 2.5 years.
Sure. Yeah, good to be back. Yeah, my name's Paul Robichaud, and I'm a professor of English at Albertus Magnus College in New Haven, Connecticut. And I'm also the author of Pan, The Great God's Modern Return, from Reaction Books, came out in 2021. And I write about myth, I write about literature, and I'm currently working on a book called Stories of the Stones about myths and legends and stories about standing stones, places like Stonehenge and uh, other sites like that in Britain and Ireland and Brittany.
I know you're making another book, and I just have one question on it. But what are your thoughts on Stonehenge?
My thoughts on Stonehenge. I think, you know, I think it's very much it's really an icon of all those kind of Neolithic kinds of monuments. And I think I visited there last year, and I think it's hard to see fresh because we've seen it so many times. Um, but it really is it's an overpowering and really impressive structure. And the fact that it was built, really before the invention of the wheel, is really astonishing. And of course, there are a lot of sort of alternative and interesting theories about it. But um, from what I've read, sort of recent archaeologists, it was possible to transport these stones and to elevate them without a lot of modern technology, although it required a massive number of people. They have some similar, I guess they have some similar sites in the East. I think it's in Malaysia, and it requires, thousands of people over months and months and months to do this. So whatever the origins, whether it was Merlin using his magic to raise the stones or you know, thousands of people, it's an amazing accomplishment. And, it's been a site that's fascinated people for centuries and invited a lot of speculation and inspired a lot of stories and explanations and things like that.
Well, with your interest in myth and just folklore in general, I mean, when you're looking at the topics that are more of the ancient world or things that go back to a different time period, do you think the general public, has a good, I guess, perception of how smart ancient peoples were? Because it seems like a lot of things that have kind of stood the test of time, literally, at least are still around today, like Stonehenge. They have a lot of weird theories to them, but I think we're also just very, I guess, misunderstood of how smart people were back then in their own way. Maybe different in our way. We'd probably be like, I could just easily send a text. Why would I have to send a pigeon, with a letter strapped to it? But back then, they were very, very sophisticated. And I've learned more about that diving through like ancient Sparta.
Right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think some of it is, if we're thinking about places like Stonehenge and so on, I think some of it is kind of long impact of sort of images of cavemen, like our ancestors wearing some skins and clubs. And if that's your image of what people were like in prehistory, it's hard to imagine them designing and building and organizing these kinds of places. And I think that's kind of those kinds of images have lingered on, kind of in the popular imagination. But one thing we do know about traditional societies is they're very in tune with the landscape around them, with the resources around them, and they look and they feel their way in the landscape in ways that are really different from modern 21st century people. And uh, they understood the principles of the properties of stones, and um, they like to create a lot of drama in the world around them. And I think that's true whether we're talking about kind of ancient sites like Stonehenge or Avebury or some of these other places, or even getting back to Pan, thinking about him a little bit, who's very much kind of the embodiment of that sense of mystery and awe that ancient peoples had about the wilderness, about the land around them. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we assume that we need all of this technology to come up with, structures, temples, whatever. But the ancient world, even without the tools and the kind of computational power uh, we associate with computers and things, they were able to do a lot with geometry, and an understanding of kind of sacred geometry, their vision of the universe as being orderly and being reflected in numbers and proportions and things like that. And when it and that's true of the Greek and
Yeah.
Roman civilizations and others, but that's also been a source of speculation about some sort of those more ancient cultures like Stonehenge. And a writer named John Mitchell, for example, famously in the 70s, 60s, 70s, argued that the Neolithic people had some knowledge of this kind of sacred geometry, and that's how they were able to design things like that. So yeah, the ancient world had a lot of wisdom and knowledge that I think would really astonish us today, because we're so addicted to this idea that we're getting smarter and smarter and more sophisticated and have more understanding. And clearly in some areas, that is true, right? Like science and medicine and so on. But the ancient world, they knew what they felt they needed to know. And I think they had a lot of insights that we've, perhaps lost, thinking again about our relationship to the landscape and,
Religion.
like, yeah, and religion too. Yeah, definitely.
I think when we talk about sophisticated literature, I mean, how much when you examine the old myths and folklores of the day, do you really try and take note of just the creativity or divine inspiration that these people were really focusing on? Because as much as we look at it like, oh, interesting little mythical fairy tale type stuff, to them it was more than just a religion, it was a lifestyle as well too. I mean, people built cults to certain gods, people built shrines, statues, spent hours and hours of time thinking if they didn't do a particular ritual, then next thing you know, you could have a bad harvest. It doesn't always have to be evil, but it can lead somewhere where people really start examining a concept that we have kind of lost in the 21st century. It's where prosperity comes in. You know, prosperity can also create problems in a way in a society. I'm just interested, I guess, in your take on myth and folklore, how these ancient people were coming up with such creative ideas, or maybe a resemblance of mere truth to some of those stories. You know, not everything has to be a god has to be real, but some of the battles and things that could be attributed to certain anger and wrath of something probably has a scientific explanation. But it's also fascinating because there is a real account sometimes.
Yeah, right. And I think I think part of the problem for us today, thinking about the idea of myths as just being kind of fairy tales, or, we'll use, we might use the word myth to describe something that's not true, and I think we have a really kind of impoverished idea of the imagination. We tend to think, I think, of something that's imagined as just being not true. Like it's a short line for us from imaginary to fake. We don't really think of imagination as being much else other than kind of like personal creativity, something we've envisioned or whatever. But I think that's a really limited way of thinking about the imagination. And I think that if you look at more traditional cultures, even Western culture and, centuries past, there's a much richer sense of imagination as a way of understanding the world and kind of experiencing it in a meaningful way. And I think that that's where we kind of get get back to myths and, folk tales and, traditional fairy tales, and even more modern kinds of literature. There's a way in which storytellers use stories, and even the word use isn't quite right. It's, you know, storytellers tell stories. Sometimes they're stories they've inherited, they've handed down, and so on. But they're ways of not just making sense of the world, like explaining, why the sun is in the sky or why we have day and night or something like that, but also of finding meaning in those kinds of experiences and meaning in the landscape. So, to say, an ancient god was something that people believed in, but was kind of imaginary in our terms. It isn't really, I think, a very helpful way to think about it, because the gods were real for ancient people. They're real today for people who believe in them, and or whatever their god happens to be. they're not real for people who don't believe, you know. Um, but again, I think the idea of like the imagination and finding meaning and storytelling are all really closely, closely tied together. And it's really our loss, I think, that we have this really limited sense of imagination. Like the imagination is real. Things that are imagined are real, within the imagined worlds we create. But that doesn't mean they're valueless or they're not as real as other things. They're real in a different way, if that makes sense.
It does, but like when we talk about the mythos, if we bring this to Pan, do you sense any realism or realistic nature involved in it, or kind of like an explanation of the universe and nature around it? It seems like every god was already picked to have a certain role and cast, and then they were like, well, let's look at this one and create this one. But then there's the belief that he might be a son of Kronos or an offspring of Kronos.
Right. And Pan is really fascinating with his kind of mythical origins because he's I think a good starting place is to sort of recognize he's not one of the 12 Olympians originally. He's this outsider god, and that means that he's sort of on the outside of the mythology that is pretty inclusive. There are different variants, of a lot of the Greek myths and so on, but it's more or less a coherent kind of Olympian world. Like, you can tell those myths and they sort of follow one after the other to some extent. But Pan is outside this whole system, and so there's different ways in which he's brought in, but he never quite fits. Um, so if we're thinking about his mythical origins, he starts out in Arcadia, this really rural, kind of impoverished area in ancient Greece. And he's associated with flocks very early on. Let's just kind of go roughly, the 6th century. He's an Arcadian god associated with flocks in the wilderness. And the interesting thing is, in Arcadia, there aren't any representations of him. Like he doesn't appear visually. The earliest statues where Pan's name appears are pictures of depictions of shepherds, and they seem to have been offered by shepherds, hoping for protection or hoping for blessings or something like that. Um, and he's also connected to our idea of panic. So there's a consistency throughout the ancient world from very early on that Pan inspires this sudden experience of fear. That's panic. That's why we call it panic, because it comes from Pan. And so if we're thinking about a kind of real world, to us, a sort of real world basis for Pan, the foundational kind of experience, if I can put it that way, is that feeling of overwhelming uh, awe and terror that we might experience in the wilderness, right? And all of those elements kind of combine with Pan, but we don't start getting his appearance depicted until his cult spreads outside of Arcadia and he starts being worshipped in other regions of Greece, like Boeotia or Athens. And it's in Attica, the part of Greece where Athens is located, that we start to see pictures of Pan and he's portrayed in the way we still think of him today, with his goat legs and his horns. The earliest depictions really portray him very goat-like with a kind of human torso, and his face. Looking at when I was writing the book, kind of looking at all these different images of Pan in the ancient world, there's a lot of variation. Some artists, especially in later centuries, depict him with a very human face. It's just his little pointed ears that kind of suggest the animal there. Whereas other depictions, he's really goat-like, and you kind of have this like spectrum from goat to human in his face. But it's interesting that he doesn't appear visualized in that way until his cult leaves Arcadia and comes to Athens and other places. And my background's not as a classicist, so I'm kind of relying on what other people in that field have said, but there's been some speculation that Pan might not have had any appearance at all originally when he was in Arcadia, that he was a kind of invisible presence, guarding flocks, inspiring terror in the woods, things like that. But his image becomes established pretty early on, and after it's spread, there are Arcadian images of Pan, with his typical goat features. There's a really nice little statuette where he's got his hand over his eyes, like where he's covering his eyes from the sun as he watches over the flocks. Most likely, that's what he's doing. Um,
Does his image match his myth or his folklore? Because if you're talking about like a guardian or like kind of like a wilderness spirit or a god of the wilderness, you want something that's more animal-like than probably man to have those features. But also, I mean, how does that conflate with when Christianity comes into the picture? Because you're basically depicting the devil if you see a statue of Pan. I mean, I hate to put it like that, but there's a lot of similar features.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on here because the other so I want to talk about Pan and the Devil. Um, but there's a lot going on here because what I've been describing, there I haven't been telling any myths, right? Like there's no myth. There's just these aspects of his worship or the cult that seems to have been around him. And this is actually a really striking feature with Pan that there aren't that many myths around him. And we don't even know if there were originally myths around Pan. It's not until a little later. Um, but part of the attempt to kind of bring him into that Olympian world of mythology is the myth you alluded to earlier, where he's imagined as a kind of half brother to Zeus, a son of Kronos, and he participates in the war of the ancient Greek gods against the Titans. And he his main his the main thing he does in that war is to rescue the sinews of Zeus after Zeus has been torn apart by the Titan Typhon or Typhus, and Pan goes and he rescues Zeus's sinews, and Zeus is able to reassemble, and they're able to defeat the Titans. And so he has this kind of important role in that mythology. Um, but there's something really mysterious about all that because it doesn't it doesn't fit very well with with Pan, like Pan's character, as we know him as this kind of god of the wilderness, a chaser after nymphs and so on. There he is really, in battle and so on. And I honestly don't quite know what to make of it. There are some mythographers who sort of look back and wonder if that story of Pan actually comes from a slightly different.
More of an extremist views.
Yeah, or it's a really like really pro-Olympian kind of interpretation, like we're going to make Pan one of the gang here. Um, but it's different from his appearance in other myths. The most famous myth, which was recorded by Ovid in the first century, who was a Roman poet, and in his Metamorphoses, he tells all of these different myths, and they're all kind of centered around transformations. That's why it's called Metamorphoses. And it's a really short myth, and it's a story about how Pan um, saw the nymph Syrinx, and he immediately was overcome with lust for her. The Greek gods were often overcome with lust, but Pan, because of his associations with goats, which were, traditionally thought of and are pretty lusty animals, he has that kind of uh, I suppose, that added dimension. But he goes and pursues Syrinx, who's utterly terrified at Pan's pursuit, and she steps into the river Ladon, and she asks her sisters for help, and she's transformed into a reed. And Pan is so disappointed, so heartbroken by this. He takes the reed and he cuts it into pieces, and he makes his famous little pan flute that we see him play. And he sits and plays kind of sadly by the river uh, about her. And there again, that myth is hard to I think it's hard to find a lot of meaning in. It's in one sense, it's just an explanation of, how did Pan get his pipes? Like why? Because Pan is, in addition to being sort of part goat, Pan is often seen with his pipes that he plays. Um, and it's an explanation, how did Pan get his pipes? And it's also one that shows him, in a kind of lustful sexual pursuit. Um, and those two myths are really kind of the main ones we have for him. So there's not a lot of mythology around Pan. Beyond that, we could mention the two kind of hymns about him. The Homeric hymn to Pan. These were hymns to one of many hymns to the gods that were attributed to Homer. Best known for the Iliad and the Odyssey. But he in this hymn relates that Pan is the son of Hermes, who fathered him on a nymph, and it's a very lighthearted little hymn. Pan is born and he's hideous looking, and so his nurse runs screaming away. But Hermes comes and he's really happy at how weird his son looks. So he brings Pan up to Olympus, and the gods are all delighted with this strange looking child, Dionysus especially, we're told in the hymn. And they name him Pan or All um, because he makes all of them laugh. And so, the hymn tells us Pan likes to dance in the woods with nymphs and play music and so on. But that's, those are kind of the traditional myths associated with him. And as we see, there's a contradiction. Like he's either the son of Kronos or he's the son of Hermes, but he can't be both. Um, and these aren't really reconcilable in any way. And that's one of the things that is actually, I think, really fascinating about Pan, that he is contradictory from the very beginning, right? He's like his appearance is part human, part goat. He's the son of Kronos or he's the son of Hermes. And there's another really important contradiction that comes a little later in antiquity. The Orphic hymn to Pan is one of a number of later hymns to the gods from, I think, around the third century AD. And in it, Pan is acknowledged in his kind of pastoral role. He's guarding flocks and doing that kind of thing, but he's mainly presented as a god of the cosmos. This idea of Pan's name meaning all, which is technically incorrect, but it was an early misunderstanding of where that name came from, um, expands outward, and he's thought of as literally the god of all. He's the god of all the elements, earth, air, water, fire, the stars, the cosmos. And so we have this other kind of contrast or contradiction between Pan, the local shepherd god, who's kind of friendly toward people, although he likes to frighten them sometimes, chases nymphs, guards sheep. And this idea of Pan as this cosmic power who might even be identical with Zeus, the hymn sort of hints at. So all these contradictions run throughout the ancient world regarding Pan, and I think it is one of the things that makes him really fascinating. Um,
Well, can I ask how wide-ranging the depictions are? You gave me a few examples, but I mean, from the super extremist, like viewpoint of him being almighty and overall powerful, one of the 12, basically. He can beat with the best of them, compared to the one that just seems like the outcast. Which one do you feel like resonates best with you of your depiction or understanding or what you would like to view Pan as?
yeah, well, that's a good question. I think, well, I guess I'll just say about the two depictions. I think in the ancient world, probably his most popular persona was as the god who's helpful, the local god who's helpful. Um, you had when we were talking earlier, you'd mentioned Herodotus, who talks about how Pan appeared to an Athenian runner as he was going to Sparta for help against the Persians, named Pheidippides, and he says to Pheidippides, I really like the people in Athens. Why don't they ask me for help and I'll help them? and eventually he brings this message back to Athens, and they, make sacrifices to Pan, and Pan scatters the Persian armies, makes them panic in their camps, and so Pan got this little cave kind of grotto shrine near the Parthenon in Athens, and he was honored every year. And so that friendly local sort of god seems to have been the most popular. The cosmic god of power and mystery, he seems to have been the form of Pan worshipped in like in the Orphic hymn by these kind of mystery cults, these religious groups that you were initiated into and promised sort of higher spiritual knowledge or experience or something like that. Um, for me, my feeling about Pan, the Pan I like best, I feel the most connection to, I suppose, is really that kind of local, more natural sort of Pan. And I think, my probably my earliest interest in Pan came from reading The Wind in the Willows many times when I was child. That's a novel by Kenneth Grahame. And there's a chapter in it called The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. It's often omitted from American editions because it's a very openly pagan kind of chapter, and you can imagine, conservative Christian parents getting a little upset at their children reading about this. And the Piper at the Gates of Dawn is Pan, and the chapter tells how Mole and Water Rat go looking for this missing baby otter, and they gradually hear this amazing, beautiful piping music all along the river, and they kind of get lulled into a sort of dream almost, and they land on an island, and there they find him, the Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and he's overwhelmingly awe-inspiring, and Mole starts to cry, and they're overwhelmed with a sense of awe, and there between his hooves is the baby otter that has gone missing and everybody's been worried about. So the Piper restores the otter to them, and then they bring the otter back, and they wake up and they have no memory of this encounter. They just have this strange memory of hearing music, and it's this really beautiful kind of poetic, and I think even reading it as an adult, I still find it actually really kind of moving and mysterious. And that's I guess the Pan I feel kind of most connected to.
Have you ever came across a god or mythical figure that really doesn't have a proper origin or a direct straight line of their story? Like Zeus, god of all gods. It's kind of the end of the discussion there. He's got a linear line to him. I mean, he's very definitive in what his powers are. I mean, there's many myths about him, but overall, he's always powerful. Hera's the same way, being the mother of all the gods, and she has her rage and spite moments. But Pan, there's so many different depictions, whether people like him to be not so much lackadaisical, but they want him to be kind of how a lot of people want to view the earth as peaceful, natural, flowing with everything that goes around, compared to where some people, like if you're gonna be, bragging about something to your best friend or something like that, you always try and one up them. And it's like when people go, oh, I don't believe in Pan, I don't, worship him because I worship Zeus and he's almighty and powerful. Well, I'll tell you my favorite story, and it was about Pan using his flute to beat the god Apollo. It doesn't mean he's the best. It just means that he can stay up to par with some of the main ones, which still keeps him in the discussion when you're having discussions about gods and their power. I mean, Poseidon controls the sea, so obviously fishermen and other people would be very attracted to that. But if you're trying to enter the discussion with your god, Pan, and not a lot of people consider maybe him not so much of an important role figure, you bring up a story where he doesn't overexert his abilities and power to seem like it's definitely all like you're really just trying to make him because you must be his number one fan or something. But they really try and keep him in the loop by saying, well, did you know the one time he beat Apollo with his flute? And you go, okay, well, Apollo's the god of music, so he has to be good at something, right? And he didn't brag about it. So then it keeps him in the more of the humbling aspect.
Yeah, and I think it right, and I, I think Pan is unique in the way he doesn't have that sort of straight line of I don't know, mythological development, or that straight sort of storyline in ancient Greek mythology. And there are the the myths around him, the stories like his musical contest with Apollo, they're sort of to one side of the main kind of storylines of ancient Greek mythology, um, and yet there are always these kind of weird hints about Pan being maybe more important uh, than it seems at first, because a number of ancient authors mention that Apollo learned prophecy from Pan, for example. There's I haven't come across much else connecting Pan to prophecy, but the simple fact that a story like that was told, there's some recognition behind that Pan possessed um, po powers that went beyond, frightening wolves away from sheep and chasing pretty nymphs around down by the river. And so I think, and again, I think it just kind of comes back to this really fascinating contradiction that we come up against with Pan. And so whatever version of Pan you find if you find Pan an engaging sort of God that you connect with, it does mean you're leaving out all these other things. I mean, my uh, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, that's a very different kind of Pan figure than the Pan who's chasing Syrinx to the river, or the Pan who's helping Zeus rescue or his sinews from the Titan. And it seems that whatever aspect of Pan we encounter in a myth, or a literary depiction or a work of art, it's a portrayal that is leaving out something. Like there's always something else with Pan that we could look at or think about or experience in some way.
What about the depiction from Socrates?
Yeah, so Socrates, uh,
Because that's got to be the most influential considering Socrates' background.
I think so, and if it's the one I'm thinking of, it's this little prayer Socrates makes to Pan, which is also, I think, really mysterious too. He prays to Pan, and what he prays is that his inside and his outside are sort of in balance with one another. I can't quote it off the top of my head, but that's what he's praying for. Like, let my essentially my inner life and my outer life, you know, be be at one with each other. And that again seems to me a little mysterious. Like, what what is he tapping into there? What is he uh, hoping to attain that Pan in particular is going to bring? I mean, um, I think he's thinking about a kind of equilibrium, kind of balance between the world of our outer lives and our inner lives. But why Pan, right? And it might be connected to that idea of Pan as being the god of all that develops a little later, a little later than Socrates, but is still kind of implied by Pan's name, right? So if we think of Pan as all, then it sort of makes sense. If he's all, he includes our inner world and our outer world. So maybe that's why Socrates turns to Pan. Um, and just a quick note on that, Pan's name doesn't actually mean all. I mean, we use it in this way, like in pandemic or Pan American Airlines or whatever. But the Greek Pan originally came from a different word that was connected to the idea of pasturing. So like you pasture your sheep, and so his name is really connected to an earlier root there. But the Greeks, they heard his name as being the same as their word for all. So I think Socrates might be drawing on that, but I'll be honest, I found that a really mysterious moment in Pan's story.
What about the Christianity and demonic aspects that start coming out of Pan? Just is that based on depictions of his looks or the fear of power?
I it's so my my take on this from the research I did was that the connection between Pan's appearance and the devil is actually fairly recent. The if you go to the if you go back to the Middle Ages, the devil is always depicted as this monstrous assemblage of different bits and pieces. Um, I guess I won't say always, but often, right? So you might have a reptilian-looking leg, a bat's wing, a couple horns, some claws that you might see on a lion or something, and it's sort of to make the point that the devil is a monster. He's like against nature in every way. Like he's
He's an
rejecting and
abomination.
yes, yeah, he's total abomination. Um, and then we can sort of see how Pan's appearance would sort of fit with that. I mean, if we're just being, if we just kind of step back and think of sticking part of a man on a goat's body, that's pretty unnatural, from a traditional kind of Christian perspective. Um, but the devil in that form with the two horns and the goat's legs and that it really doesn't take off, I think, until the 19th century. Like it's relatively recent. And the big turning point there was an occult book published by uh, the magician Eliphas or Levi, and he includes an image that has become famous. If you look at any occult material or you've seen horror films, you've seen the famous image of Baphomet, this kind of horned figure with goat's legs, a human torso with breasts, and he's got a torch between the horns, and um, it's often been taken as an image, a straightforward image of the devil. Um, Levy says that it embodies all these different contradictions: human, animal, man, woman. It's related to the alchemical idea of the union of opposites in many ways. But his text does describe the image also as being Pan. And this image and its kind of endless reproduction over the last 160 years or so, I think has really cemented this kind of goat-legged, human torsoed image of the devil. But um, that is more recent than we generally think, because the traditional sort of version is that, well, the church looked at Pan and took his image and said, this is the devil and you shouldn't worship him. But it there isn't actually really evidence for that. Like it's one way, it's sort of maybe a poetic way of describing how the church demonized paganism and the pagan gods, but um, there isn't a lot of direct evidence that happened regarding Pan.
What's Pan's relation to the occult, or just the idea of the occult power?
Well, I think if I'll make it really concise. But if we go back to that ancient idea of Pan as this kind of cosmic power of all, combining all of the elements and being this sort of universal God and this God of mystery, um, and we kind of have that tradition in mind, and then we come to the 19th century and we have Eliphas Levi, whose book, um, the Ritual and Tradition of High Magic, if I got that right. Um, that book becomes an important work in the occult revival at the end of the 19th century. And that's where you have a lot of magical orders. The most famous one in the English-speaking world is the Golden Dawn, which had some high-profile members. The Irish poet W.B. Yeats was a member, and so was Aleister Crowley.
Yeah.
And Crowley, he becomes a kind of renegade Golden Dawn member. There's a lot of politics in the order. He leaves and he develops his own system. And he has his own sort of story of being inspired by uh, an Egyptian entity that he claimed to have encountered. But in his system, Pan plays a role. There's a kind of stage of spiritual development that he calls the Night of Pan. It's very similar to uh, the kind of Christian idea of the dark night of the soul. It's like when your whole self is shattered and your ego is shattered, your sense of who you are is shattered, and you come out of that night of Pan as transformed individual. Crowley also wrote a hymn to Pan
I think I
that
listened to it on YouTube.
yeah, there's actually there's some good readings of that. It's actually, it's really got a really strong rhythm, and it's something that a lot of modern pagans and students of the occult have kind of incorporated into their own kind of practices and things. But it's through that route that Pan really enters into kind of modern occult tradition. And another one-time member of the Golden Dawn, Dion Fortune, another English magician. She went on. She wrote a novel called The Goatfoot God, and she developed some rites for invoking Pan herself. And she had a more psychological kind of approach to magic. She saw Pan as embodying those kind of instinctive, wild um, aspects of ourselves that maybe as kind of sophisticated modern people we
Primal.
don't. Primal, yes, that's a good word. Yeah, primal, the primal side of ourselves that we really needed to integrate into ourselves. And so for her, invoking Pan really meant invoking that whole primal side of ourselves, and reconnecting with our instinctive life that connects us to other animals, connects us to nature more generally. So there's as always with Pan, there's never just one thing. There's a lot of different ways his appearance, his powers, his traditional associations have been incorporated into modern occult spirituality, and he's also been identified with and is an inspiration for the horned god of the witches in modern Wicca as
Now,
well.
with 20th century Pan, how does that differ so differently from maybe the more earliest versions of Pan? And does it have any significance today when we talk about Pan? I think if we talk about a world that's completely connected with their phones and devices and completely disconnected from the outside world, I feel like Pan probably would resonate a lot more with people that are looking for that more adventurous and more, when I say adventurous, I just mean going out into nature. I don't mean going on a hike. But just something that brings you more in tune with the things around you. I find that a lot of people, when they're able to slow down and take a step outside, they start feeling that kind of myth of what I believe about Pan, which is just a figure that kind of looms around the forest and helps when help is needed, but doesn't want to go and take the overarching 20 extra miles to go fight a monster or something like that. It's very not bland, but I live within my means, and my means aren't much.
Right. Yeah. I think looking back, if we take Pan seriously, um, we might wonder if kind of every age gets the Pan, not so much the Pan they deserve, but actually the Pan they need. And so this aspect of Pan that you're alluding to, which is very similar to the that sort of Piper at the Gates of Dawn idea, the in its nature in its helpful and nurturing aspects, whether it's kind of physical nurturing or more spiritual, that experience that psychologists tell us is really positive, of just walking in the woods, being under the canopy of trees, being, um, you know, transformed in some way through that. And I think that is the aspect of Pan that really gains momentum over the 20th century into our own century, where if you think about Pan's appearance in the popular children's series, the Percy Jackson novels, which my stepson read through when I was working on the
Read
book.
them all. I love
Um,
them.
yeah, and Pan appears there too, and he's fading away, and he leaves it to us to protect the wilderness, to sustain that. And so I think this kind of ecological Pan, if we want to call him that, um, I think that's the Pan that resonates most strongly for people today. However we connect with that, whether it's through stories or through the experience of just, maybe being solitary in the woods. And I think that's a really, really positive thing, because Pan is about life. He's about um, he's about the natural world and its non-human aspects. And it really, as in the Percy Jackson series, it really is up to us to make that connection and to find meaning in nature in that way. But we have to start by acknowledging that nature is, other than us. It includes us. We're part of it, but it's not human. If that makes sense.
I'm going to turn on the interviewer mode real quick and just ask you, based on the author's perspective, how hard was it for you to find source material and look at records and be able to, like, where did you look for records about Pan? I mean, obviously you can Google on the internet and come across a lot, but did you have to dig through some varying archives to know what you wanted to include in your book?
Yeah, my background, I'm really a literary scholar. I mean, my background's in English, and before Pan, I mostly wrote about I mostly wrote about modern poetry and published a little bit myself here and there over the years. But one of the things that happened when I was writing Pan was the pandemic. And that made the research component a little challenging because I was unable to access the local research library that I normally use because it was closed to visitors. So I had done a fair bit of sort of library research already, but I did find myself having to rely fairly extensively on materials that I could find online. So this is my true confessions moment. But the wonderful thing was that many, maybe most of the sources at that point I was looking for, I was able to find online. But to sort of circle back to your question, um, my starting point was a really great book from 1969 by Patricia Merivale, called the Goatfoot God, and that was a survey of Pan, mostly in 19th and early 20th century literature, but um, it, it 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 inspired me to kind of look beyond that. And so I didn't do this was not a project that I did really archival kinds of research for, but I did have to read a lot of books about like ancient Greek religion and reading some of the classics in translation. I can get by with Latin if I have to, but I don't know Greek at all. So I relied a lot on translations, and at the end, um, as we come forward and the book kind of explores more recent centuries in European literature and culture and art and things like that, I was able to um, engage with those texts in their original languages and so on. But um, the one advantage I realized as I was getting towards the end was that actually um, I could I could provide the reader in my notes with the links so people could go and read sources online, because as I experienced trying to finish the research for my book, not everybody has access to a big university library. And I do think the internet has been very much a mixed blessing. There's so much disinformation and so much nonsense out there. But at the same time, there are a lot of really great resources available, sort of older scholarly editions. Google Books is a great resource if you're looking at 19th century texts and things like that. Yeah, so I drew in a lot of different kinds of sources, but I was fortunate enough to have the full library experience at the beginning, but I found myself having to rely on increasingly on online sources towards the end.
Have
So
you found anything that wasn't appearance based but had a significance, like a sense of symbolism besides the pan flute when it relates to Pan? Anything that through all the overall myths that stayed relatively kind of around in various othering myths, not just one specific?
yeah, right. There's a couple of things associated with Pan that are beyond the flute, and he wears a skin pelt from a lynx. And that that's an interesting one because the lynx is a really wild sort of animal, so we have that kind of wildness associated with him. It's also a kind of, from an ancient Greek perspective, kind of an exotic animal. So contributes this sense of Pan's otherness. But the lynx was also sacred to Dionysus, and um, again in that original Homeric hymn, Dionysus is the god who welcomes Pan most strongly to Olympus, and in later myths, Pan is one of the gods who accompanies Dionysus on this kind of epic journey he took to India to fight some battles and things. But Pan was always included in this procession of Dionysus, the Thiassos. And so those two gods are really closely connected, and that lynx pelt that Pan wears is an element of that. The other kind of odd thing with Pan is that we don't see too often, but occasionally he'll have it in a statue, is something called I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but a legobalon, which is a kind of club that was used to kill hares, like hares and rabbits, I guess. And that points to an aspect of Pan that has sort of fallen by the wayside over the centuries, and that's Pan as the god of the hunt. But he was a god of the hunt, and in Arcadia, if hunters had a bad day, they blamed Pan for this, and they would actually beat his statue with a type of plant related to the lily or wild onion called a squill, to sort of punish Pan a little bit and encourage him to help them more. And that's kind of an interesting one too, because uh, I don't
It
think
doesn't
anyone.
resemble a god, it resembles a servant.
Well, yeah, it's a different relationship than you might have to Athena, right? I mean, or Zeus or something. So there's he's a god, but he's a god at a very kind of human level. Pan is this contradictory god, right? We have Pan as the god of the hunt, but then we have this later development of Pan as the protector of the animals, as protector of all of nature. So it's everywhere we turn with Pan, we encounter a contradiction, and that there may be a sort of lesson there, I guess, which is that reality is always more complex than we're experiencing it as in any given moment, right?
Are you surprised that even though Pan isn't considered or shown off in such these various powerful ways or strength ways in the sense of how we would consider strength, and especially at those times, warlike would be considered power and strength. But Pan's not depicted this way, yet the myth has still lasted 3,000 something years, where you really examine, did you need power to make something last so long? Zeus and all them, they base all their myth now or their belief in how people know them now is because of the fact they were such an important, powerful figure. But if Pan's just the one that kind of never needed the spotlight as much and kind of, had his attributes in certain areas, we still have his remembrance today. I think everyone knows the symbol of the pan flute, probably thinks of a person with goat legs.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. And that again, that was one of the things that kind of drew me to write about Pan in the first place. Was um, he sort of survives in in kind of a living way throughout the centuries. He disappears for a little while in the Middle Ages, but certainly since the Renaissance. And um, I think it's because he has this aspect of him that is much more accessible, much more approachable, much more down to earth than the great Olympian gods. You can imagine Pan sitting by the river bank playing his flute. Maybe he's just around the corner, And I think these Olympian gods are really awe-inspiring and powerful. Their stories are really fascinating, but um, it's hard to feel that they're in any way on our level. I mean, they're even in even something like Homer's Iliad or what have you, that human beings so often seem to be the playthings of these gods. They're kind of they decide what's going to happen to us. They're so powerful. They don't care about us really. And we often are, thinking about the Iliad to some extent pawns in this divine kind of conflict that's playing out. Pan is a god who's on our level to a large extent. if we're going back to his origins in Arcadia, he's watching our flocks. He's keeping the wolves away. He's maybe helping us on our hunt, and if not, we can, have a word with him afterwards. Um, but that makes him a god that is is relatable in some way, um, and I think that's one of the reasons why he has kind of endured through the centuries. I think all these contradictory ideas or versions of Pan um, that I've been kind of talking about today also mean there are all these different ways that people can sort of connect with him. He's kind of a very adaptable god, you know. So if you're a practicing witch or pagan, he can be the horned god of the woods. Um, if you're maybe a more serious kind of occultist, maybe he's Aleister Crowley's Knight of Pan kind of god. If you're neither of those things, but just kind of someone who has a feels a more spiritual relationship with nature. I mean, Pan can be a way of just kind of imagining that connection, you know. Um, and so I think he really does kind of speak to our current moment where we are really thinking about our relationship to the environment and how we can kind of preserve uh, the wilderness that is left in the world. But also the way we're kind of thinking about nature is something, we need to sustain us, right? I mean, it's like again that experience of just walking under the trees. I mean, you might not be able to go hiking in the mountains, but you might be able to have lunch in the park under a tree once in a while. And just that kind of experience is really renewing and refreshing. And I think, again, Pan is kind of the embodiment. He's the way we can kind of symbolize that connection we have to nature.
What do you think about him being the son of Odysseus?
That's a weird one too. Uh, so that that goes back to I feel like my Pan trivia is really being tested here, but that one goes back to the question of Pan's origins, and one of his mother was always a mystery too. Generally speaking, everyone agreed it was a nymph, but which one? Um, and there was a nymph named Penelope who, if I recall correctly, she was the daughter of Dryops, who was this kind of oak god. Um, but Penelope was uh, also the name of the wife of
Hades' wife.
Odysseus.
Well, Hades'
Uh,
wife too. Didn't he steal? Oh, that's Persephone. Whoops.
Persephone, that's Persephone,
Whoops.
yeah. But if so just kind of thinking in terms of the myths there, if Pan is the son of Penelope, well, maybe Odysseus is his father. But that seems, I mean, that was not a kind of commonly accepted sort of parentage for Pan, and that one to me feels a bit like some very literary Greek scholars in ancient times kind of um, reaching for it. But I think the deeper issue is this real uncertainty, this question about where does Pan come from, and the fact that there are so many contradictory accounts of who his father is just reminds us that at a fundamental level he does not really fit into the Olympian uh, pantheon. He is an outsider god. He may be a more ancient god, hard to say, but he just doesn't really fit. But there's that one always feels kind of, I don't know, sort of fake and literary to me. Like, but I think we can see the confusion there with the name Penelope, and that sense of confusion is also very typical around Pan. It's you get the feeling sometimes with Pan that he's sort of winking and laughing at all these attempts to kind of make him make sense and make him be one thing or fit him into something. He's just out of reach, I think.
I just got one last question for you, and I actually saw this on your Twitter, but you posted up a statue of Pan that seemed a little bit more aggressive than maybe some certain depictions. And I'm wondering, like, how many of these statues have you seen, and which ones? I mean, they're fascinating to look at, but which depiction do you kind of start noticing that you find that you are more attracted to compared to maybe where the artist has inserted their own perspective or visage of what they want Pan to be?
Yeah, right. There are a lot of Yeah, there's a lot of ancient statues depicting Pan. I think, he must have been really kind of fun for ancient sculptures because they're always making these perfect men, perfect women's bodies, and they're really out there. And then Pan comes along, and you get to sculpt some goat legs and make a face as strange as you want. So I think artists must have enjoyed making statues of Pan. And he sometimes is portrayed a little aggressively. For example, there's a depiction of him uh, kind of he's it's a statue of Aphrodite and Pan is clearly imploring her. He's trying to seduce her, and she's about to swat him in the head with a sandal, which shows, I think, as well that ancient people found Pan kind of funny, and so there's a bit of joking going on there. But my favorite statue of Pan is one from I think the original was made in Sparta, but it survives as a Roman copy, and it's in marble, but it's Pan, and he's all wrapped up in this fleece blanket, and we see his little legs and hooves below, and he has a very kind of animal-like face, but it's very mysterious. He has this really mysterious smile, and he's kind of holding the blanket kind of over him, and it's a depiction that is really unusual. I've never seen any statue like it, but for me, it really captures the mystery of Pan. It's a very mysterious smile. It's almost a Mona Lisa like smile. Like, what is she? What's he thinking? What's going on here? But I like it because it conveys a real sense of mystery around Pan, and there's something really kind of magical about that to me. It's not portraying Pan in a way that's kind of funny, like we're going to have a good laugh about it. It's not, you know, it's not a kind of explicit statue of Pan. There's a number of sexually explicit statues of Pan from the ancient world as well. It's one that it feels to me to have a real kind of respect for the god, and really conveys that feeling. We have this word numinous, a sense of like mystery, kind of awe-inspiring. And I really like that one. That to me kind of captures that aspect of Pan.
Now, if you're going to talk about doing a second book, because I have to ask about it, not about the new stuff, about Pan though, another reversion of it. Was there anything you couldn't include in your original book that you felt like would be more fit for a second edition? Because I feel like with Pan, there's so much vast information out there, just vast different types of stories and myths that you probably wanted to spend a little bit more time on that you just couldn't based on page lengths or um,
Yeah, well, it's right, and right. So, um, like uh, like a lot of writers I am now writing to a word count. So that means you have to be really kind of selective about what you include. And I think that the truth is that to really have a comprehensive kind of book on Pan, in myth and legend and in art and literature and so on, you'd really be looking at almost a kind of encyclopedia. And even in terms of the ancient sources, I'm not a classicist, so I think we've been focusing a lot on Pan in the ancient world, and that's fine. I really read whatever I could about that, but there's a lot of kind of shorter references to Pan all throughout ancient Greek um, literature and mythography, and I think an expanded book on Pan would really want to look at those things in more detail. And I think as well, the later chapters, I'm an English professor, and I really focused heavily on um, English and American, but Anglophone writing, and I think there's definitely some interesting work to be done about Pan in kind of non-English speaking cultures, and I touched on some of those, but I think yeah, uh, there's certainly there's painting, there's literature in other languages, there's ancient Greek sources that I wasn't able to bring in, and uh, I think a truly comprehensive look at Pan would be absolutely enormous and probably somebody's lifetime's work. But I hope to provide it at least kind of an introduction, a guide, an overview of the different aspects of Pan through the centuries, and hopefully inspiring people to kind of follow up on whatever they connected with and go kind of explore on their own. But yeah, there's definitely a lot more to say, even in terms of Pan and the modern occult revival and things like that. So definitely a huge topic.
Well, Paul, I appreciate your research that you have done for your book and also keeping the myth alive. Especially, sparked my interest, and at least I'm learning more about it each time we talk. But is there a place where people can find any of your links? If you have your Twitter, Amazon, any other links you'd like to promote?
Yeah, so my Pan book is available in paperback. You can order it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, or ideally your favorite independent bookstore. It's from Reaction Books, which is distributed in the U.S. by University of Chicago Press, and my Twitter handle is at Paul J. Robichaud, and you can find me there. And there's a link to the publisher there as well.
And all those links will be in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.